Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. I am grateful to CIF and SAF for believing that history matters. I'm not sure how much it matters, but that you're here at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock is a joy for me. I'm thrilled also to be able to talk about the emergence of the United States Forest Service, which is about to enter into its centennial year. I have taken a leave this year from my university to participate in that centennial and will be speaking around the country, around the United States, on its development and growth. It's a talk that lasts largely, usually an hour and a half. I have 15 minutes. This will be quick. What I want to talk about today, as the title suggests, is how the West was won, or at least how we think it was won, or at least how we imagined that transformation to have been. One of the ways to think about that is to keep in mind that the past matters to an extent, but not entirely. We don't really understand it because, frankly, we really don't understand ourselves. And for me, what the past really represents is the way in which contemporary folks understand themselves. They use that past to explain themselves to themselves. We're not really talking about the past because we don't live there. To quote R.D. Laing in another context, I can't experience your experience. And if that's true at a contemporary level, it is surely true from the past speaking to the present or the present thinking about that past. And frankly, there is no way that the past is really a guide to the future. I know that just undercut virtually everything that I'm supposed to talk about, but that's the way it is. Because, in fact, I'm actually going to contradict myself, so watch that. What I'm struck by at looking at the history of the United States Forest Service is the degree to which its very existence makes no sense. Charles Kay earlier spoke of the way in which Native Americans were not great conservationists by any stretch of the imagination, or at least as we understand that term. Neither were those European migrants who came here either. For them, this landscape was one to be utilized as rapidly, easily, and as efficiently as possible, and that meant cutting everything down that lay between them and the world that they encountered. I won't claim that this map is entirely accurate. I use it as a representation only of what they perceived to be the inexhaustible supply of timber in 1620, or pick your date, whether you're the Spanish coming up from the south or the English and others moving from the east moving west. It doesn't really matter. The notion was that what they were encountering was a landscape they had never encountered before, and therefore, relative to the places from which they came, particularly a largely deforested England, any tree, any amount of tree, seemed to suggest an inexhaustibility that they would quickly try to cut their way through. That raises, though, a question. If in 1620 this is the world that they imagined it to be, and one starts to track these processes, if I could have the next, there we go, thank you. By looking at 1850, the conception is that something has happened. A great deal of some things have happened. Lots of trees have been cut. But we can really look at this slide in two directions, that which is missing and that which is still there. That which is missing is logical and obvious. You take those places where, you cut in those places where you have ready access, where there are streams that will allow you to float that timber to market, wherever that market may be. Into the Piedmont and other areas where you want to farm, it's logical to take out the trees themselves. But it's just as surprising, by 1850, a mere decade before the American Civil War was about to erupt, where they had not cut or had not cut extensively. And again, the logic is clear, but keep the logic in mind. If you'll note where they did not go, in addition to northern Maine, which has sort of slid off our map here, or off the screen a touch, the Great Lakes states, by and large, had not yet been thoroughly cut over. The Appalachians themselves are largely untouched. The middle sort of central south along the Mississippi River is basically there. And then, of course, the Great West itself is largely uncut at this point. But push it out a mere 70 years. And again, as a representation, not necessarily precisely accurately, what we're looking at is a celerity of harvesting that boggles the mind. Until you start to ask, well, what's going on between 1850 and 1920? How is it possible, if I can go back a slide, that you go from this to that in such a rapid speed, in such a capacity that really is astonishing? The Industrial Revolution is crucial. The laying down of railroads is essential. And take the railroad historians as sort of the central icon of the Industrial Revolution as a fact and a reality on the ground itself. Those smokestacks, those locomotives really are the engine that drives that transformation, at least as we understand it, and for good reason. Think not about the locomotive, but think about the track. And think not about the track, but really the tie. And you get a sense for at least why some of these forests disappeared so very rapidly. Since you had to switch out track roughly every 5 years, and you start to look at the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific, and start thinking 3,000 miles of track, multiple times that have to be switched out every 5 years, that's a lot of trees that are going to be consumed until they figure out that creosote is a way by which to stabilize those ties and preserve them over an extended period of time, or a relatively extended period of time. The need for wood, for fuel, is even more compelling, actually, than the need for wood for ties. The city of Philadelphia before the revolution was consuming upwards, if not exceeding, 17 square miles of forest a year simply to stay warm. That's an awful lot of trees disappearing to go up into smoke out of thousands of chimneys. If you look at photographs of early American and I suspect Canadian cities as well, don't look at the buildings, count the chimneys. That's how you know the relationship between human use and woodland and what they're using that wood for, which is how we can get to this point by the 1920s. And finally, aggressive imperial agriculture is going to take out forests because, of course, you can't farm if you're trying to deal with this process as best you can, which raises a set of questions. As you harvest, and this is a shot from 1910 from Michigan, as you took out the pine of the Great Lakes states, what replaced them? Those stumps are still there, so what didn't happen? They didn't farm. It turns out the logic that they had been utilizing as they came across from the east into the Great Lakes states didn't actually make sense in the context of the soils of Michigan. What might have made sense in Massachusetts, and certainly made better sense because it was better soil in Virginia, doesn't really make it when you go into an area where the landscape is not actually that supportive. That this was a slide used by the Forest Service itself to enhance its argument about why it should exist is also important, because this was a photograph taken by a Forest Service employee. This is the archetype of how they will argue that there are some lands that actually should not be farmed, that should remain in forest, and if they've gone, then what we need to do is reforest, not continue the foolish effort to try to produce agriculture on land that won't sustain it. So propaganda and photographs obviously work to an extent that's really quite important. But to get to the point where you can have an agency that has a technology like a camera that will make this claim in through its image requires understanding, as we go back a slide, to understand why it is that anyone would see this slide in the ways perhaps that we do. If you look at the three slides that we started off with, 1620, 1850 to 1920, a way to interpret them is as symbols of progress. You're reaping one resource to generate homes, to generate fuel, to produce an economy, to do all of the things necessary to build human life in the new world under industrial conditions, or in time under industrial conditions. But we might look at those slides today in the early 21st century in a way that's fundamentally different perhaps than those in the late 19th century did. We might look at them not as progress, but as destruction, or at least that's a possibility for us as an argument. And that there are at least two ways to interpret these series of slides suggest that there was, in fact, by the late 19th century, a growing perception that what they thought was progress had reached one set of limits, and that subsequent progress might mean responding to the land in a fundamentally different way. And so these slides, which actually come from a talk from the third chief of the Forest Service, William B. Greeley, were part of his intellectual effort to make the claim that the agency that he was now the head of had a historic obligation to turn these maps back into black as best as possible. That is, its job was to reforest a landscape that had been heavily harvested, and in that process begin to transform how people thought about the world around them. So to see this picture coming from Colorado in 1915 and see it not as a social gain, and a social benefit. Though the timber that came off here may be shored up mines, may have built trains, train lines and the like, nonetheless, the argument is not just to look at the trees, but to look at what else? But the land and the badly eroded soil. And in effect to say, this is an image that we need to retouch up. We have to, like painters, rework this scene and come up with a new way by which to imagine that. And one of the people who will give us that language is George Perkins Marsh. Marsh is a central figure in the process of transforming how Americans thought about their landscape. In his book, Man and Nature, which came out in the 1860s, a book not heavily read, but a classic nonetheless, which is how you know it's a classic, because very few people read it. My thanks to Mark Twain for that observation. Marsh sets up the argument in which he will argue in the middle 19th century that the landscape was going, that its devastation was intense, and that we had two options, one of which is to ignore what was before our eyes, the other of which is to see what was before us and argue in a different way, that we must now become the stewards of this landscape, not just its raw consumers, that we must now reforest in a variety of ways and begin this process. And although I don't think most Americans read Marsh, I do know they read the cartoons. And if you start to look at cartoons like this age of the wood pulp fiction in which a novelist standing before a clear cut begins to recognize that there's a relationship between the pages in his pocket and the landscape that lies before him, and that, God willing, we will produce more wood to produce more novels, is crucial, as does this series of cartoons. I've only partly clipped them, in which it's part of the argument is when the trees go, so goes Memphis, or St. Louis, or Des Moines, pick your city. Because once the trees are gone, the water flow will transform. The Mississippi will no longer be the father of waters. It won't have any water in it. And worst of all, if you can see on your right, is a ship entering into an American harbor, a U.S. seaport, filled with wood from Europe. The worst possible outcome for an American to imagine in the late 19th century, that we become ultimately dependent on the people from whom we tried to leave and from whom we have long claimed to be so fundamentally different. It turns out, so the cartoon would suggest, as does this, that there is a timber famine. It is real, and it will produce for this nation, the United States at least, a terrifying impotence, because Samson figures heavily in this slide as the backstory to it, that if you have no timber, so George Perkins Marsh said, you would become like Rome, you would become like Greece, you would become like like Lebanon, which no longer has those extraordinary cedars. That's the central reason why we must change. It's more complex than that. I would urge you to come to the afternoon session so we can talk more in depth about this. But what out of this emerged was the conception that we can remap the landscape. We can literally start to fill in those blanks by creating something we call national forests, by laying them out on the land, by creating people with very cool hats who will manage those forests, and let's call them rangers, and give them a uniform and give them a book to read. It's a good book. It's the use book. It's the book that will define what their job is. But also, most crucially, since it's called the use book, it's actually not about trees. It's not really about animals, except the human animal. It's how do we manage human beings that matter now, not how we manage resources. A fundamental transformation that will produce this extraordinary photograph, which I love, which is on the frontispiece of a novel called Kavanaugh, a forest ranger that came out in 1910. This ranger is in control of the West, as best one can tell. He's on his hat, and I swear he's looking to the west. He has to. This is how all American iconography goes. He looks out over this landscape on his horse with his use book, with his hat, and he is in charge of 1 million square acres. So he's actually not really in charge of 1 million square acres, but the motif is this is how this process unfolds. And Hamlin Garland's novel opens up a discussion that I think is absolutely crucial. Garland argued that the Forest Service was the driving wedge of the new modern nation state. It had nothing to do with trees and had everything to do with enhancing federal sovereignty in landscapes where there had been no such control before. To build a modern state, which in the United States means the executive branch being first among equals. There is a legislative and there is a judicial, but there is always the modern state around the executive. which is not to say without the Forest Service this would not have happened, but it is to say that the Forest Service is in fact representational of this transformation that occurred and that produced these national forests now draped across the West in ever larger numbers, that then produced series of political controversies around their very existence, which then would produce some of the great cartoons emerging out of Colorado in the early 20th century, arguing that Gifford Pinchot, as head of the agency, would be bucked by the wild horse of the West, that West was increasingly having the imprint of federal sovereignty in the face of Teddy Roosevelt smacked into that landscape. You got the teeth down here? That those water reserves and those timber reserves being laid out were signs, in fact, of the omnipotent power of the federal government in the body of the guise of the Tsar Gifford Pinchot and his Cossack Rangers. That we laugh today, at least in the West. I show this periodically in the East and they don't get it. And they don't get it because they don't come out of this tradition in which this is in fact a sagebrush revolution or rebellion that has been ongoing in American history since the early 20th century. The moment those lines were laid down for those maps, up came this process whereby we had battles and have continued to have battles over sovereignty and over land. But from Gifford's point of view, of course, he was in a soft hat, not a crown. He was a regular guy who was arguing that the agency in his day was custodial, largely reforesting and worrying about water, not about trees, and it would not be until the 1950s that the hard hats were put on, signifying that a new way and a new set of issues were emerging that would in fact confront the agency beginning in the 1960s, partly around the issue of clear-cutting in the Bitterroot here in the 1960s, early 1970s, but really about that set within a broader context. And I'm going to run through this quickly because I'm losing time, but I do want to come back to this afternoon. There's a relationship between, on the one hand, clear-cutting and national forest and the creation of suburbs, which is not simply about the wood. It's about the human beings who live in these, well, let's call them homes, who then logically don't want to recreate here, but want to recreate in places like the Bitterroot, and then the disjunction between the fact that you live in a house made out of wood and want to recreate in a place of wood, except to do that you have to cut out the wood that you want to go visit. And there lies, it seems to me, the paradox in the middle 1960s and 70s that confronted this culture and broadly North American culture about how to live in a space that you have to consume. And how to get the two values simultaneously turns out to be pretty difficult, especially when you start to lay down roadbeds beginning in 1930s that by the 1970s have basically remapped this nation, the United States, around highway nodes intersecting around urban areas that have produced massive population shifts to the south and west into areas where the national forests are. And so when we talk about the urban-wildland interface, we're not completely obvious or clear enough about the historical origins of that dilemma and the reason why that dilemma will continue to emerge every fire season when this particular line, and this is a fire in Boise in 1994, the line between that fire and the suburban houses in the foreground are become critical, partly because they're an image that gets flashed across the screen, partly because of the politics that lie behind fire. And the key politics has to do with electoral politics, not with ecosystem management, not with new forestry issues, but really about the politics of fire built around a landscape that regularly burns, and burns now increasingly in urban areas where people have their first homes or their second homes or their third homes, depending on their wealth and status. Do keep in mind that at least in the American system, that turns really on electoral votes. Because as the population sagged south and moved west, so they carried with them their most precious object, their vote. And with that came political power to regions that didn't have it before. And as the West cooks and burns periodically, those phone calls go into those politicians who then turn around and use that constituent anger and angst to begin to argue for different kinds of fire regimes and, frankly, new budgets. We are told frequently, never shout fire in a movie theater. But if you want money out of the federal government in the United States, shout fire all of the time. Thank you very much.